Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second Brazilian Conference on Henry James Studies. My name is Larissa Neves. I am currently a professor at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil, where I teach academic writing and literature. This online event is organized by the Henry James Study Group, the first research group in Brazil dedicated to the works of Henry James. Our objectives are to encourage the reading of both Henry James's fiction and nonfiction works and to foster academic research on his legacy. To help us achieve these objectives, there is no scholar more qualified than Greg Zacharias, whom I'm honored to introduce as our closing keynote speaker today. Greg Zacharias earned his PhD and Master's in English and American Literature from New York University, and he also received his bachelor degree in the same field from New York University. He's a leading Henry James scholar, and he has always been a champion of undergraduate research and a valued professor at Creighton University. Notably, he was named Nebraska Professor of the Year in 2014, and in 1996, Professor Greg Zacharias founded the Center for Henry James Studies, and he serves as the General Editor and Project Director of the Complete Letters of Henry James Studies, which is an ambitious undertaking involving the transcription, editing, annotation, and publication of over 10,000 manuscripts from Henry James's papers. This project stands as one of the most extensive literary letter initiatives in history. His talk today is entitled Henry James's Letters and Why They Matter. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Greg Zacharias.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and to be included in your meeting. My talk has three parts. First, an overview of Henry James's letters. Second, a discussion of strategies for presenting them. And third, some notes on the importance and usefulness of James's letters. Henry James was not only a prolific fiction writer, critic, playwright, and travel essayist. In addition, he wrote a lot of letters, possibly more than 16,000, if his letter writing frequency early in his life was similar to that later. Next slide, please. Of all the letters he wrote and sent, about 10,500 survive. It is the surviving letters that James wrote and sent that the complete letters of Henry James is publishing. It is safe to say not only that writing mattered for Henry James, but that writing for him was a way of living. Next slide, please. The first known of Henry James's letters was written around 1855, when he was 12 years old. Next slide. And the last one in 1915, a few months before his death on 28 February 1916. Many more letters survive from later in James's life, after 1876, when he moved to London from Paris and began working harder at his profession than before. Given his livelihood as a writer and his record of professional publication, many of the letters that survive are business letters that negotiate fees for his work, set up schedules for submitting chapters for serial publication, and the like. These business letters are important not only for understanding James's own professional life, but also for understanding more about how the Anglo-American literary marketplace operated during James's lifetime. Next slide, please. This opening page from James's letter to Clement Shorter, with which James came to terms for the serial version of The Other House, represents one such change in the publishing business. Shorter's demands for James's punctuality nearly sent James into a breakdown during the summer of 1896. Having been referred by Lucy Clifford to Clement Shorter in his sensational weekly, The Illustrated London News, James and Shorter agreed on 26 February 1896 that the serial would be, quote, 65,000 words in 13 installments of 5,000 words each during July, August, and September next. For his side, James promised Shorter that I shall endeavor to be thrilling. At the same time that he and Shorter came to their agreement, James was already writing the serial version for the Spoils of Poynton, titled The Old Things, which would begin in the Atlantic Monthly in just a few months. So at the time, James was exploiting an opportunity to earn well by writing 2 novels in less than 1 year. Finishing the Spoils of Poynton and beginning The Other House made April and May busy months. Soon, the continued strain from trying to meet writing and social commitments began to build and produce negative effects on James. On 4 July 1896, he confessed to Mrs. Humphrey Ward that he was in a bad place. I am in deep waters, and I need your prayers, he wrote to her. The beginning of August was especially stressful. Shorter, who was responsible for his weekly publication, pressed, even harassed James with telegrams to meet his deadlines in a more timely way. At that point, James had to choose between professional obligations and caring for his friends. He chose publication commitments and consequently faced complications from that choice. On 7 August 1896, for example, feeling ashamed for having to cancel their plans in order to meet a deadline, James wrote to Oliver Wendell Holmes and urged Holmes to kick James for his bad behavior toward Holmes, who had come to England from the United States to visit James. 4 days after sending Shorter the last chapter of the last installment, and thus fulfilling his contractual obligation, James began to mend friendships. On 28 August, in a long letter to Edmund Goss, James apologized profusely for his incivility and explained its causes. Next slide, please. He wrote to Goss, in an evil hour, I began to pay the penalty of having arranged to let a current serial begin when I was too little afraid of it, and it proved too much slower and a more difficult job than I expected. The printers and illustrators overtook and denounced me. The fear of breaking down paralyzed me. The combination of rheumatism and fatigue rendered my hand and arm in torture, and the total situation made my existence a nightmare. Without James's letters, it would be very difficult to reconstruct this important series of life events. As a London resident or frequent visitor from late 1876 until his death in 1916, James had a steady, even active social life appropriate for his age. Many of James's letters that arranged social meetings and appointments survive. Next slide, please. This letter is from 23 January 1893 to Lady Wolseley, who had been trying to arrange a dinner with James. As James gained fame, more of these social arrangement letters were probably saved by their recipients. But the 10,500 letters don't consist only of short 1 or 2 page business and social arrangement messages. There are many long letters to close friends, letters of 10, 15, even more than 20 pages that detail James's life plans, day-to-day experiences, and hopes for the future. There are other long letters that console and support friends who have had tragic events happen to them or who are suffering for any number of reasons. Next slide, please. See this letter to Alfred Littleton, first in James's hand and then from our edition. Next slide. Littleton's wife had died in childbirth less than a year after their marriage. And this is James's letter to console his friend who just lost his wife. Such letters to friends enable us to witness Henry James's empathy and his understanding. Next slide, please. As of today, we've published 16 volumes in the Complete Letters edition. All 16, next slide, earned the approved edition seal from the Modern Language Association's Committee on Scholarly Editions. The 17th book, with letters from 1887 and 1888, should be published later this month. Editing and annotation are complete for volume 18, which takes us to letters written in April 1890. Volume 19, which includes letters into January 1891, is planned, letters transcribed, and many are carefully edited, but none is yet annotated. Beyond the 19th volume, most extant letters through 1897 are transcribed roughly, with hundreds more transcribed in the same way through 1915. Next slide, please. Including letters in the 17th volume, the ongoing edition contains 2,032 letters, which we represent in plain text style. Of the 2,032 letters in our first 17 volumes, 1,126 are published for the first time, and 906 were published first elsewhere. Most of the previously published letters lack textual and informational notes before our publication of them. So even previously published letters are represented in our edition with more context than before. For comparison, Leon Dell's 4-volume edition called Henry James Letters contains about 1,100 letters in both corrected and uncorrected clear text style, but without textual notes and with spare use of content notes. Ignace Scroupscalis and Elizabeth Berkeley's Correspondence of William James gives its first 3 volumes to Henry and William letters, with 421 from Henry. The William James Letters edition contains a full textual commentary and good content notes. I mention these numbers and details to give you a sense of the growth and the breadth of our edition. With the appearance of the edition's 17th volume later this month, we will have edited, annotated, and published about 1/5 of James's extant letters. If future volumes each include about 170 letters, as the last few books have, we'll need about 50 more volumes to finish the job. Work, then, has only just begun. The complete letters part of our edition's title isn't completely accurate. We aim to include as many of James's letters as we can, but there's no way to include, of course, letters now lost. Inclusion depends first on a letter's survival. Second, including a letter requires our knowledge of it and of its location. If we don't know about it and don't know where to find it, we can't transcribe, annotate, and include it. Next slide, please. Steve Jobs' Calendar of Henry James Letters made our edition possible. Job's calendar, which he produced as a spiral-bound paper book and is now available, as you see, as a searchable web tool, has more than 10,400 letters with their date, recipient, location of the letter, and its shelf list number. It registers whether the letter had been published and where, at least at the time the calendar was produced. So it's a great tool for us, an essential tool for us, and other users who want to know more about Henry James's letters find it a good tool as well. I'd like to talk a little now about our approach to presenting the edited letters, and the approach that we use is known as plain text editing, and we adapted it from the Mark Twain Letters Project. Letter projects, as well as projects of diplomatic and other historical papers, are known as documentary editing projects because they all involve documents. All documentary editors must decide at the beginning of their projects where, on a continuum of reliable at one end of the continuum and readable at the other end of the continuum, they want their projects to rest. And in this sense, reliable implies faithfulness to the original, and readable implies ease with which an untrained reader can apprehend meaningful elements of the edited document. Okay? So reliable wants to represent the document. Readable really wants to represent the editor's understanding of what the author intended to write. So they're two completely different aims. And one cannot, it's really impossible to do. One cannot represent one's documents simultaneously at both the reliable and readable ends of the editorial continuum, right? So the editor has to decide the degree to which an edition is readable. To that extent, it's not reliable. If it's reliable to that extent, it's not completely readable. So that's the problem all documentary editors face. The most reliable edition could be a facsimile edition of high-quality scans or photographs of the documents. The facsimile edition would be extremely faithful to the original. Next slide, please. But it would be far from easily readable. Here are two examples of facsimiles of Henry James's letters. Next slide, please. So you can see how reliable these letters are. I mean, this is what the letters look like, but they're hard to read at the same time. The most readable edition would be one in which misspellings in grammar and punctuation errors were corrected by editors so that the edited letter text would read with the finish of a prepared for publication document. Such a highly readable way to represent a document is known as corrected clear text. Corrected clear text represents the editor's determination of the writer's intention, but not finally of the document itself. Next slide, please. This is Leon Edel's clear text version of Henry James's letter to Houghton Mifflin concerning the portrait of a lady, or part of the letter. I just want to kind of concentrate for the sake of contrast and demonstration, this letter versus the original, and then against a plain text version of it. Edel's version illustrates the point that at the same time corrected clear text is readable, it's not always reliable in terms of the original document. Next slide, please. Here's what the original document looks like, right? Notice how the elements of this letter failed to find their way into Edel's published clear text version. Next slide. Right. So you can kind of do a little comparison. Look, for example, at the first line of the letter, 3 Bolton Street, and you'll see that at the top line of the manuscript on the other side, you'll see 3 Bolton Street. But what you don't see in Edel's version is the rest of the return address, right? Piccadilly West. He just left it out. And there are a couple other items on the original that Edel just left out of the corrected clear text version. So missing from the corrected clear text letter, the readable thing, not the reliable one, but the readable, are James's formatting of letter elements, which I assume are deliberate or at least conventional. How he sets up the paragraphing and so on is what I mean by letter elements. But there are textual omissions too, and thus losses of meaning. Notice that Edel omitted part of James's address, and that is Piccadilly with the W. Edel omitted James's addressee, the long underline about a third of the way down the page, Messrs. Houghton Mifflin and Company. He just left it off. Also omitted from Edel's corrected clear text edition is James's double-struck week, the strikeout in the letter itself, and the caroted insertion of night, a change that marks James's answer to his publisher as virtually immediate rather than a week old. And what I mean by that is you can see before it was struck out, James is telling that he returned from the continent last week, he wrote first, and then must have realized that if he kept that in, he would be telling his correspondent that I left your message for a week before I answered it. So he changed it from last week to last night. And that change marks James's answer to his publisher as virtually immediate rather than a week old. All this in only 9 lines of a much longer letter, a result of the effort to achieve a much more readable but less reliable version of James's original. Next slide, please. And then this slide is our plain text version, which aims to capture more of the meaningful elements of the original letter while still being easy to read and use. And so you can see some of the elements that Edel decided to leave off that we included in our version. If corrected clear text is the most readable, in facsimile the most reliable, with uncorrected clear text a little more reliable than corrected clear text, then plain text editing, which we use for the Henry James letters, is somewhere toward the middle of the reliability, readability continuum. Plain text aims to represent all significant elements of James's letters, including cancellations and corrections, through a reader-friendly apparatus in the edited letter texts. Such writing details are markers of Henry James's thinking and consequent language choices made as he wrote. For example, as you see in the plain text version of the letter to Houghton Mifflin, we represent James's careted, marked insertion with a caret mark. We represent a word struck once. In this case, it's struck out once. But if it were struck out twice or three times and so on, we try to represent that as well. Next slide, please. To provide the richest context possible, we provide after each letter a full textual commentary to assist readers in the reconstruction of details of the original, if that should be the reader's interest. Next slide, please. And we also provide a list of informational notes to help readers understand the letters more exactly as James's own reader did. In Henry James's 13 June 1889 letter to William James, Henry describes the state of their sister's health. And as some of you know, Alice James, their sister, was a chronic invalid whose physical health problems were never fully determined. Next slide, please. In the midst of that description is a word struck, not with one cancellation mark and not with two, but with three cancellation marks. Henry James evidently didn't want anyone to see what was underneath the strikeout. But after some manipulation of the image, I read the struck word as the slightly indecorous lopsidedness, which Henry James substituted, next slide, please, which he substituted with the milder precariousness. And you can see the strikeout with the careted in word above it. This larger excerpt from the letter gives a good view of the change. Next slide. Compare our representation of that part of the letter with the struck out lopsidedness and precariousness inserted. This is how we represent it. Compare our representation of that part of the 13 June letter to Scrupscalis and Berkeley's, next slide, uncorrected clear text version, right? Where you never would know what had been there in the beginning and what had been struck and what had been substituted. And then also again, to the reproduction of the letter itself. Next slide, please. Right. Each form of editing has its own audience. And it's a good thing, I think, for readers to think, what is the best version for you? Something that describes the text readably or something that describes the text reliably. Being able to have an understanding of meaningful elements of the original manuscript via the edited letter is important. But it's not the only reason for a large edition of letters. In addition to textual reliability, some readers want an edition that attempts to represent all known letters of a particular author so they can read the various biographic and artistic arcs that are drawn through those letters. James's letters to his parents and to Grace Norton offer examples that are representative of the value of extensive letters series to individual correspondence. Henry James Henry James's parents supplemented his income into the 1870s, that is, until James was some 30 or so years old. Without their help, he could not have frequented the quality of hotels he did, for example, while traveling in Europe before 1875 or so. James's letters to his parents and family members at home, which would usually be shared with friends too, are among the most detailed he wrote. The two factors, quality of letter details and parental financial contributions, are related. As long as his parents were financing his travel, James wrote highly detailed long letters describing his experience in a way that only he could. In those letters, Henry James carried out deliberate writing performances. Thus, these letters amounted to payments for his parents' financial support. In his 10 and 12 March 1869 letter to his sister Alice is filled with brilliant descriptions. Next slide, please. It's also typical of James's earlier letters home. Thus, James wrote, "I may say that up to this time, I have been crushed under the sense of the mere magnitude of London, its inconceivable immensity, in such a way as to paralyze my mind for any appreciation of details. This is gradually subsiding, but what does it leave behind? An extraordinary intellectual depression, as I may say, and an indefinable flatness of mind. The place sits on you, broods on you, stamps on you with the feet of its myriad bipeds and quadrupeds. In fine, it is anything but a cheerful or charming city, yet it is a splendid one." For all the spectacle he assures readers and listeners he has taken in, all the experience he shows he's gained, there's more. James went on in this letter to describe how Leslie Stephen, then a famous literary man who would later become the father of Virginia Woolf, how Leslie Stephen himself took young Henry James for a Sunday afternoon around London. They went together to the zoo. They went for a ride on the new Underground Railroad. They went to tea together. Other meetings with the famous and distinguished are outlined, but without any gushing or without any fanfare. Clearly, this 26-year-old is doing what his parents sent him to England to do, to take it all in and report back to them. Clearly, he is earning his money. Reading James's relationship with friends over the course of dozens or hundreds of letters in a comprehensive edition is a benefit that a selective letters edition can't match. Henry James had known Grace Norton, the sister of James's mentor, Charles Eliot Norton, since at least 18 November 1868, the date of his first surviving letter to her when he was 25 and she was 34. Their friendship lasted until his death. James's letters to Grace Norton exposed the nuances, compromises, and life adjustments needed to care for such a friendship. In a letter we've been able to date only as 18 February to 12 August 1883, when Henry James was back in Boston following the death of his father, and following a Saturday evening dinner party at which Grace, upset that Henry wasn't paying enough attention to her, either left the party, went home, drank a large glass of whiskey, or, upset, drank a tumbler of whiskey at the dinner and later wrote James a note about what he had caused her to do. This is how James responded on Sunday morning to the incident the night before. Next slide. He responded to a Grace Norton note this way: "Your note finds me on the point of writing to you. I will dine tomorrow with great pleasure, but only on condition that you are in some decent sort of health. The state my unhappy dinner threw you into, you drank a tumbler of whiskey, fills me with rage and shame for myself." While some might ridicule Grace's behavior, James never did. In James's 28 July 1883 letter to Grace Norton, next slide, he reaches out to her to affirm his empathy and friendship in response, it seems, to her battle with depression. And he wrote to her, "Don't melt too much into the universe. Don't melt too much into the universe, but be as solid and dense and fixed as you can. We all live together, and those of us who love and know live so most. We help each other, even unconsciously, each in our own effort. We lighten the effort of others. We contribute to the sum of success, make it possible for others to live. Sorrow comes in great waves. No one can know that better than you, but it rolls over us. And though it may almost smother us, it leaves us on the spot. And we know that if it is strong, we are stronger inasmuch as it passes and we remain. It wears us, uses us, but we wear it and use it in return. And it is blind, whereas we, after a manner, see." Even this short excerpt from the long letter conveys the humanity that letter after letter to James's many long-term friends and colleagues contain. Now, there is something new in James's letters from 1889 and 1890, which is worth mentioning, and which shows itself rather suddenly in the book that should be out later this month. And what's new is a darkening of James's language, especially the use of the language of killing and dying. Next slide. Let me give some examples. In his 26 March 1890 letter to Frederick Macmillan, James bargains hard for better publication of the tragic muse. He witnesses that he is loath to perish without a struggle to receive advance payment. However, James's figurative sacrifice of his own life, perishing without a struggle in such a bout of haggling, wasn't enough. Next slide. He reserved the same for his correspondent, finishing the letter to Macmillan thus: "I gather that the terms you mention are an ultimatum excluding for yourselves the idea of anything down, which is why I make this declaration of my alternative. But I should be sorry to pursue that alternative without hearing from you again, though I don't flatter myself that I hold the knife at your throat." 2 days later, not having received an acceptable offer and coming close to what would be a break in his professional relationship with Macmillan, James returned to extreme language. This time it's not about separating from life itself, but instead about James cutting himself off from both Macmillan and from the English literary marketplace. Thus to Macmillan he wrote, "Unless I can put the matter on a more remunerative footing all around, I shall give up my English market, heaven save the market, and confine myself to my American. But I must experiment a bit first, and to experiment is, of course, to say farewell to you." Even with the intervention of his agent, A.P. Watt, who rescued the contract with Macmillan for the English edition of The Tragic Muse, James would not publish another novel with Macmillan until after The Tragic Muse until 1896. Next slide, please. James again used the language of death and killing facetiously on April 20, 1890, to Henrietta Rubel, as he apologized for not having written to her more often. Now that I have my pen in my hand and feel once more the full privilege of conversing with you, the full horror of the figure I must have presented to you quite takes my breath away. Never mind, I consent to be breathless, away, trodden under your Louis Quinze heel, or even under the wheels of your hospitable chariot from round the corner. Mock self-humiliation as an element of apology was part of James's performative writing self. But his extension of self-humiliation to death or serious injury under the wheels of a carriage is a new feature. I'm not sure why James turned to this language. One motivation could have been his penchant for drama and emotion. But drama and emotion can be achieved without the language of violence or killing. Perhaps the language of violence and killing was just a more effective but different way for James to elevate drama and emotion in his letters. I'll need to track this and think more about it. And I'd be grateful if anyone here today could explain the sudden appearance of James's language of death and killing. In any case, my time is up now. Next slide. Thank you for listening to me. I'd be glad to take questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Greg Zacharias. This was a very thought-provoking talk. We have many comments here in the comment section of our YouTube, and I'm pretty sure that the insights that you shared with us, today enriched the understanding of the Jamesian legacy. And I would like to share with you some comments before we start with the question.
Sure.
With the question. So Professor Luisa is saying, Professor Zacharias, congratulations for your conference and for your work in editing James's letters.
Thank you.
Thank you for your conference. I'm learning a lot from it, Professor Linda. And we have many congratulations here.
I could answer the nice comments by saying one of the things that we do in the Henry James Center is help scholars of all levels with their James studies. So if I can help anyone do anything, please get in touch with me.
Yeah, that's so nice. Thank you very much. So I guess we can start with the questions. We have a very nice question today from a student of mine. Actually, she's only 17 years old. I'd just like to add that. And she says, in the context of publishing writers' letters, could you please explain how privacy considerations come into play to avoid a potential invasion of the author's privacy, particularly when these letters are published posthumously?
James was concerned about this, that his privacy would be invaded. I think it's probably worth mentioning that James, in his reviews of a lot of other letters collections, never said that about somebody else's privacy, but only about his own. It's a concern, but I think James is really a historical figure now. There was a lot of concern on the part of some family members, probably for 40 years after his death, that certain aspects of his life would be embarrassing to the family, maybe aspects of his sexuality, for example. But I think things that embarrassed people in 1916 and in 1920 don't really embarrass us today. So that's kind of the longish way of answering the question, that we really don't think about, in a sense, it sounds terrible to say this, but it's the truth. We don't really think about privacy issues. The only one time on the edition that we had kind of a question about how to represent something that James wrote, and he wrote it, he put it in a letter, he put the letter into the mail, he sent it to somebody read it, and somebody saved that letter. Was his use of I think everyone knows what I mean when I say the N word. James's use of the N word. And James used it. He was a person of his, I don't think he used it frequently, but he used it in this one particular letter. And so we had a kind of a longish discussion one afternoon about whether we should use the whole word, whether we should have N and then a dash, how we should handle that. And we decided to represent the letter reliably rather than represent something readably. But other than that, James was a private person, and I think he did not put things into his letters that he wouldn't like other people not to read. So part of the privacy concern, James took care of him a little bit himself already. But it's really a great question.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. Thank you, Professor. So we have another compliment here made by Professor Marcelo Payne. He says, "Thank you for your talk and the work with Henry James's letters. It's such an impressive job."
Thank you.
Could you tell us one or two of the discoveries you made during your work with the letters, both related to Henry James's life and to his known ideas about art and literature? Oh, that's a hard question.
It's a hard question, but it's such a central and fundamental question. One of the discoveries is that he almost never talks about art and literature in his letters. It's extremely infrequent. Sometimes he talks about the progress of his work, what he's working on, what he's planning to do. A lot of the business letters show details about his work. When he submitted chapters and so on. And so in that sense, by giving sort of the micro level of his work, not his work's product, but his work progress, for me, it was a kind of a big discovery how hard he worked, and how constantly he worked, and how much of a hardworking professional writer he was. When I started the Letters Project, or started thinking about the Letters Project, we really had a completely different idea of Henry James. It was really Leanne Edell's idea of Henry James the master, right? Someone who just kind of shut himself off from the world, from the regular world, and hid in his writing room and wrote novels. And it's really the access to the letters, which kind of began in the early and mid 90s, that showed us a different Henry James, a person who cares a lot about his career, who works extremely, extremely hard, and relatively, frequently, and who cares, as we all do on some level, more or less, about the money that he's earning. Some people are, I think, some readers are a little critical of James for being so concerned about his income. But in James's day, there was no social safety net. There were no retirement programs. And so without a family to take care of him, he really had to worry about his old age. And so I think that's why he paid such attention to his income and his spending. So those are the couple of things that were real surprises to me through the letters.
Yeah, and I can imagine that it was also surprising to see the amount of letters, because it's such an extensive work. And then, if you don't mind my question, could you answer to us when you started working with them? I mean, because it's a never-ending reading, right? We were talking about that. We were talking about that this morning, because James wrote so many books, so many short stories, and everything, and we don't get this feeling that we're ever going to finish reading everything he wrote. So I don't know if you feel the same.
When we started the Letters Project, at the time, Michael Inesco works with me now, and but someone else did, Peter Walker, and Peter and I did different kinds of different work studies to figure out how long would it take us to accomplish an edition of about 10,500 letters. And we thought if we could have 2 people work full-time on the letters project, we could do the 10,500 letters in 15 years. It would take 15 years to finish. And so since we started, we've had no one work full-time on the letters because we're all teaching and, doing administrative work and so on. But the actual time is kind of holding up pretty well. But we just don't have the capacity to do full-time work now. So if you could get 2 people to work full-time, maybe we would have 7 more years.
Okay.
So I have to buy lottery tickets and hope that I win the lottery.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now, given the pace, we publish 1 volume per year. So given the pace, as I said, I think it'll be over in about 50 more years. So it'll take 50 more years unless we can find a way to hire more people and go faster.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time, but it's for sure worth it. Thank you, Professor Zacharias.
Thank you.
So we have another comment and another question. Would you have some extra minutes?
Oh, absolutely.
Keep on talking
as long as you want.
Oh, we're so happy to have you here with us, for sure. So Professor Luisa says, congratulations again for your conference and also for your work in editing the letters.
Thank you.
She'd like to ask if we can talk about a late style for James's letters as we do for James's fiction and how it impacts the editing of his correspondence. I'd like to ask you if we can talk, and then she reorganizes the question.
Yep. The late style in the fiction was partly a product of James dictating, right? And he had to dictate because we saw a little bit of this in that 1896 letter about the rheumatism. He said that he had rheumatism in his wrist. He wrote so much, and I don't think his wrist problem we would call carpal tunnel syndrome today, right? And so that made him shift over to dictating his fiction. But he also dictated a lot of letters, unless they were private and intimate letters. So the later letters have the same kind of elaborate feel that the fiction has. So how it affects the editing, Michael and I talk sometimes about how to handle changes that were clearly made by the typist, whether we should record them in the same way that changes made by Henry James's hand, whether they have the same status. And since we haven't gotten up to publishing those letters, we don't have any sort of firm answer for that, except to say that when we find out that a change, for sure, if we can determine that a change was made by the typist, we probably won't include that as a Henry James change. And we'll only make the change when we can determine that it was in James's hand. Evidently, he handled some of the letters like he did the fiction, that he would dictate in the morning and then do hand corrections in the afternoon. So in that way, the letters were like the fiction too. But no big editing challenges, though. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, that's nice. Thank you. Well, another question here. So just please let us know when you don't have, some extra time or when you're done with us, okay? Because we're so excited to have you here. So people keep on posting questions.
Yeah, that's okay.
So Okay. Professor, how did the James's Letters project begin?
In there was a big conference in New York in 1993 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of James's birth. He was born in 1843. Several months before that conference, Fred Kaplan, who wrote a really nice biography of James called Henry James, the Imagination of Genius, was the first person outside Leon Edel to gain full access to the Henry James letters at Harvard. Most of the 10,000 letters are at Harvard. The reason why Fred Kaplan was able to gain access was because the executor had passed from one generation in the James family to another. The previous generation had restricted access to the letters. The new executor allowed access to the letters. And Fred Kaplan went around, he was like a Henry James Letters evangelist, going around the conference telling people, you won't believe what's in there. You won't believe the picture we have of James. It's so much different from the one Edel gives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of interested me, since I had always, as a graduate student and even as an undergraduate, been interested in letters and historical documents and so on. Fred Kaplan then gathered anyone interested on the last day of the conference just into an empty room he found, and we stood around and he kind of gave us one last pep talk. Like, you should do this, you younger people. I was a younger person at the time. You younger people should try to do that. And I started to think about it and try to think, could I do this? And what would I have to do this? And I basically made a plan. I got some about 10 since I was an assistant professor at the time. I got some senior people to kind of go along and be on our executive. And then I went to our called the academic vice president. He would be like a provost, university provost. And I gave him a plan. I said, I would like to have this, and I'd like to do this project, and could we have a Center for Henry James Studies? And he asked me, like, what do you need? And I told him that I needed a whole floor of a building. And he said, you're not going to get, I'm not giving you a whole floor, he said, but I can give you a room. So he gave me a room and kind of a budget. And I think it's a good illustration of how universities have changed in the last 30 years. At least our university has, where 30 years ago, an administrator could take a chance on a junior faculty member and on a junior faculty member's project and support it over time. And I think that would be very, very difficult to do now. The other thing that was kind of lucky was that the academic vice president had been in the philosophy department, and his special philosopher was William James. So he kind of knew a little bit about Henry James and the James family. So I think I was just in the right place at the right time. If it had been a different administrator at a different time, they just would have said, we can't do this. But this one said, let's try. So luck, like so many things in life, they're lucky, really. So I was very lucky.
That's so nice. Thanks for sharing with us this. It's such a nice part of this process that we don't really get the chance to know just by reading the complete edition. I mean, I haven't had the chance to read the the book of the complete letters, so I don't know if you're sharing the beginning of the project there.
No.
I don't think so. Yeah, so that's so nice. Thank you, Professor Zacharias. It was meant to be, and we're so lucky that everything turned out fine.
So far. I always remind myself, Natasha, since Natasha's visited, she knows that our office is in a room that's exactly the size of a classroom. So I always think if we're not successful, they can just kick us out and use the room as a classroom.
Okay. Well, would you have some? We have one last question from
Sure,
Natasha,
sure.
actually. So it's a very long question. She says, Professor, I really admire how you explain the possibilities of interpretation based on material details that could go unnoticed for some editors. In a paper, you argue that James's alterations of Geneve to Genoa can
Yep,
reinforce
yep.
his Americanness, and in your talk today, you also shed light on how cancellations and insertions represent his change in thinking and his willingness or unwillingness to allow his readers to see the cancelled words. So, do you think the letters should receive then the same treatment given to creative texts?
I think I'm not sure what treatment is given to creative texts, unless you're sort of unless Natasha, you're talking about showing changes, showing versions, showing drafts, and so on. I think in some ways we try to do that by showing the changes. But I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I'm not so sure either.
Yep. I mean, it's such a good question. Maybe it just we need more time to think about it. But what we try to do is to try to represent the letter itself, the document itself, rather than, even though the changes in the letter show James's changes in thinking, our primary concern isn't to show James's thinking. It's to show what's on the document itself. And so in that way, there might be there might be a difference between how different stages of a creative text are shown versus how we show the letters. The most extreme example of this, maybe you've seen, it's called a synoptic text edition of Joyce's Ulysses. And it shows all the changes to all the editions kind of in sequence, right? So it tries to pull in a sense the variations of all the editions together. That would be different from a letter, which basically only has one edition with changes within that edition. So I think maybe if that's the treatment of kind of the extreme of the treatment to creative texts, our work isn't that complicated. We don't have many editions over a long period of time, right? There are not series of variants, for example, that you would have in treating different editions of a novel or a short story. So I think we handle it conceptually the same, but our work is not as involved as mapping out changes throughout several editions of a novel or a short story.
Natasha said, yes, I am relating the changes in letters with the alterations and revisions in fiction. So I guess that's exactly what you thought.
Yeah. I think we just have a similar concept that when James makes a change, we want to show the change. Just as if I were editing, well, I am editing the Other House, for example, now. And so I want to show what changes he made from serial version to novel version, right? But in that case, there are, in a sense, two documents to collate. Where with a letter, in most cases, I mean, there are very few exceptions, but in most cases, there's only one document to report on rather than two documents. So that would be the main difference.
Okay, that's so nice. Thank you, Professor. Louisa is also saying, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Melissa, thank you so much for your answer.
Thank you.
Oh, Marcelo has another question, and then again, it's up to you, but this would be the last one.
Okay.
That's okay. What are the main sources of James's letters?
Yep. The main sources of James's letters are really big archives. So of the 10,500, Harvard has over 6,000. Yale has a lot of Henry James letters. The Huntington Library has a lot. The British Library has their Macmillan file. They have James's letters to Macmillan, so they're mainly big archives, which is kind of good. But each year we find, I'd say, another, in a sense, it's not a main source, but it's a very interesting source that people either find or buy Henry James letters, and then they share them with us. So there's a woman, she's a documentary filmmaker in Munich, but she also collects Henry James letters. So this past summer she bought two. She was on holiday in Wales, and she saw two letters that we didn't know existed before. So she took just smartphone photographs and then sent them and gave us permission to use them. So we got there's a man who lives in North Carolina, and he was kind of worried, I think, he's later in his life, and was worried what would happen to a Henry James letter that I think he bought in the 1970s. And so he gave it to us. And that, again, was a completely new letter. No one had ever known anything about that before. Sometimes smaller archives, Eton College in England, had given to them, I think recently, this past summer, 3 new Henry James letters, which they tend to send a note and say, we got some new letters, maybe you would be interested. So it's really the big archives that have they've had the big collections for a long time, and then individual collectors who share their collections with us are the two sources. We're not exactly sure, since a lot of dealers now advertise their letters that they get on the internet, and they show images of the letters. We're not exactly sure how to handle that, because there are some copyright issues depending on who buys the letter and where it ends up. So that's something we see new letters that way, but we really can't use them unless we knew who the owner would be, and the dealers never tell. They would never tell who bought a letter. So private owners are sources who share. The big archives, we can go and get them to make us copies. Ransom Center at University of Texas and so on is a big collector. Those are the main sources.
Okay, so I guess those were all the questions we had for today. Would you like to say anything else, Professor Greg Zacharias? Because otherwise, I guess we can.
I would just say thank you for inviting me. It was nice to talk to you. I'm so interested in how you're promoting and supporting James studies. And as I said before, if there's any way that I can help, please let me know. That's it. Thank you. Have a nice day and a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much again for being here with us today. You talked about very important things about Henry James's letters. Thank you again for sharing your ideas with the Brazilian audience. We really appreciate that. And to end our talk today, I'd also like to thank the organizing committee that is represented by Natasha Costa and Diana Fortier, because without their partnership and collaboration, this event wouldn't exist. And thanks to all of you on YouTube that are there watching us. And again, thank you very much, Professor Greg Zacharias. And I guess I'll see you all in 2 years.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.